Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Hank Clark, and I'm delighted to see you here. I'm program director of the Political Economy Project here at Dartmouth, and welcome to our very last public event of winter 2021. Just a couple very brief program notes. First, do check out our website for a truly interesting and engaging lineup of speaking and events in the spring term, starting on March the 29th. And also, those of you students listening in who are still deciding on spring courses, you may have overlooked a course that the Political Economy Project is sponsoring by Danny Steinmetz Jenkins in the history department. It's a really interesting looking course. It's called Liberalism from World War II to the Present. I've looked at the syllabus. It's really a Boffo reading list. This course has never been taught before at Dartmouth, to my knowledge. It is, as I say, offered through the history department under the rubric of 90.10, and you can check out the history department website for more information about that. Now, our speaker today is Cory Smith. Cory is the PEP's postdoctoral fellow for 2020-2021. And has anyone ever had more of a raw deal at the PEP than he has? Cory was born in Chicago, Illinois, and received his economics PhD even closer to us down the road at MIT in Massachusetts in May of 2020. But due to the ongoing COVID pandemic, Cory is quarantining with his wife in Lahore, Pakistan during the academic year and has still not made his maiden voyage to our campus, I don't believe. His research interests include development, economic history, and political economy, particularly the long-run implications of land use. And we're really delighted to have him with us Zoom side as long as he can't join us in person. Now, the format for today's event will be very, very simple. Cory will speak for a while. And if you have questions as he goes along, please just click on the Raise Hands tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen so that we can keep track. I'll try and call on a couple of students to begin if there are any student questions, but everyone present is welcome to participate, and we'll take as many questions as we have time for. Without further ado, Cory, thanks very much for being with us this afternoon, or this late evening as it is for you. And the floor is all yours, sir.
All right, great. Well, really, thank you so much for that really nice intro. And, this, despite being very physically far away, this has been a very welcoming community and a very welcoming postdoc. So, certainly nothing about a raw deal. Hank, are my slides showing up okay now that they're full screen and everything?
Yes, they are. They're perfect.
Perfect. Okay, so I'm really excited to talk to all of you about land inequality and the long-run development of the frontier United States. This is sort of a quick version of my job market paper. You can see the full thing and all its gory details on my website if you're curious after the talk. But just to set the scene, this project is going to take us back to a time in when the United States was primarily an agrarian economy. And in an agrarian economy, land is really one of the most important productive assets. So, who gets to own land and who gets to own how much land is a question of primary importance. And, when it comes to the equality of land distributions, it turns out that, in the typical case, land is actually very unequally distributed. So the classic economics, measure of inequality is the Gini coefficient, which goes from 0 at sort of, a perfectly equal distribution of resources to 100 at a perfectly unequal distribution. We think of, the United States and its income distribution as being fairly unequal, and both historically and today, that's hovered somewhere around, the high 30s or low 40s. In contrast, though, when you actually look at the distribution of land, whether in developed developed countries historically or in developing countries today, it tends to actually have much, much higher Gini coefficients, perhaps somewhere in the 60s or 70s on average, depending on which places you look at. And somewhat surprisingly, this is even true of places we thought of as fairly equal areas. So places like early 20th century Sweden, or even on the American frontier, which has this reputation of being the domain of hardscrabble pioneers. So in general, land is fairly unequally distributed in many, many contexts, including the American West. Now, if you're an economist, there's a number of different reasons why you might care about this fact. One just very obvious reason is sort of an equity or equality type of perspective. Land actually is one of the ways you can get wealthy in an agrarian economy. So we'd want, perhaps to ensure an equal distribution. We might also care about the distribution of land from a productivity or an efficiency perspective. And, there's a couple of different versions of this. One version of this is just who is, best at working the land in the modern period, sort of who can get the best return out of it. Another sort of, adjacent question is who's best at investing in the land, or who's best at, making the investments that ensure long, higher levels of development over a very long run period here. And, broadly, I think the economics profession, has separated land ownership arrangements into three very broad groups. So, the first one would just be fairly simple. The person who owns the land is actually working it, maybe with the help of their family. So, the classic case of this would be, an owner cultivator working, either a very small plot or maybe still a fairly modest sized plot with their family, but nothing too large since there's a limit to how much one person and their family can work. In other cases, some owners amass, as you might guess, large amounts of land and contract with other people to perform the day-to-day work. So we think of these larger owners as landlords, and we think of the people who work for them typically as tenant farmers. And these tenant farmers might either pay rents directly to the landlord for the right to work the land, or they might come to some sort of arrangement about how to split the output at harvest time. So, the classic example of this would be a crop share arrangement where, say, the tenant and the landlord split the output 50-50 at the end. So, primarily for today, I'm going to be interested in this question of which of these, three types of arrangements is most efficient from a long run perspective. That is, which actually is best at fostering long run economic development in the agrarian sense. Now, I'm going to study this question, as you might have guessed, on the American frontier, and there's two, main reasons to do this. The first is that the American frontier featured the creation of many, many new communities in a short and observable period of time, which means that we can really study the impact of initial conditions on future development. So we can really study sort of the impact of things from very early on in a community's history, or even directly from the beginning. Now, just as sort of a historical side note, a lot of this, academic advantage is actually enabled by very wide-scale dispossession of the indigenous peoples of the American West. And while that's not something I have a lot to say about quantitatively today, this is certainly something we should keep in mind when we're, doing this sort of research. Now, the second sort of attractive feature from an academic standpoint about the American frontier is that it actually features, contrary to popular mythology, a diversity of landholding patterns. So, if you think of sort of Little House on the Prairie or other types of, mythologizing of the American West, we typically think of fairly small scale farmers looking to make a new start out in this sort of, virgin territory. So that's kind of exemplified by one person in my data set by the name of Joseph Beckwith. He was a farmer who moved out west with his family and ultimately obtained, his standard-sized homestead out in western Nebraska. There were certainly many people like Joseph Beckwith out on the American frontier, but in actual fact, they were also joined by, a very different group of people with much larger land holdings. And this is kind of exemplified by the case of James Woolworth, who was sort of a permanent resident and industrialist in Ohio, but who nonetheless obtained a very vast amount of land, something like 37,000 acres, also out in this area of western Nebraska. So the American frontier featured a diversity of landholding patterns. And one way to frame what I'm going to be asking today is, are people like James Beckwith, best at making the investments that ensure long-run levels of development? Or should you turn to people like, James Woolworth, the industrialist with his very large sort of plots of land? And, ex ante, there's many reasons to think that either person or either group really would be more efficient. On the one hand, these very large landowners could potentially take advantage of economies of scale. And, they would be able to do things like mechanize with, and not really be sort of bogged down by the cost of, advanced equipment, and really be able to use it at scale. In contrast, there's reason to think that these smaller scale owners might be more efficient. A large amount of economics research has talked about the difficulty that large landlords have in motivating their workforce. So, that can come either because their methods of motivation are coercive, or because of, more very classic incentive problems described by economists. So, if you're splitting the output with, your tenant farmer 50-50, each of you only receives, a half of a return on any sort of investment that you might make, which lowers the incentives that you have to put your own personal resources into developing the land. And that might be a reason you'd want small scale owners. Finally, a third, very economics perspective would say that as long as markets are functioning well, it doesn't really matter who you give the land to, at least, not for very long. So, if person A is not very efficient at working the land, person B can recognize this and actually buy the land at a nice price from person A, since they know that they can make more money with that piece of land. So, from this perspective, it doesn't really matter who initially receives a property right. The markets will all sort it out later. Now, all three of these perspectives are interesting and I think plausible, but unfortunately, it's very hard to sort of disentangle these, these competing types of factors. And one major reason for that is, if you compare sort of the farms of large owners with those of small owners, you might not be comparing apples to apples. Larger owners might be working very different types of land or be engaged in very different activities. And it might be that those sorts of factors drive any comparison you see on profits or productivity or something like that. So really what you would need is some sort of, almost random quasi-experimental setup where, property rights are allocated on comparable pieces of land. And some are given out to these large landlords, and some are given out to these small scale, owner cultivators. And that's largely what I'm going to be exploring in my talk today. So I'm going to be looking at essentially random or quasi-random variation in land rights from an American land policy known as railroad land grants. And essentially what this policy did was it opened up, every other square mile of land to, large holders in what some people termed a checkerboard pattern. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to study the effects of that policy, both historically and into the modern period, to get a sense of the long run development impacts. So we should think about this as roughly a 150-year time span, very, very long from an economics perspective. Now here's, more or less what I'm going to be finding. So my results tend to support, the people who favor small scale owner cultivation. And in particular, in this setting, what I'm going to find is that the larger owners tended not to make as many investments. And land that was originally owned by them actually ends up receiving many sorts of investments, much, much later in a delayed fashion. And in fact, the impact of this is still visible in modern day property values, which are lower in areas initially allocated to this group. I'm next going to talk a little bit about why this might be. And I'm going to kind of point my finger at, systems of tenant farming in general and share tenancy in particular. That is the practice of splitting the output between the tenant farmer and the landlord. I'm also going to talk very briefly about markets here and show that, this idea that markets would resolve all the differences, towards some efficient equilibrium is not crazy, but actually, the time scale for this is much larger than you would think. And, we do see a lot of convergence between places initially allocated to landlords and those to small scale owners, but the gaps shrink only at a very slow rate over time. Finally, at the very end, I'm just going to sketch out the implications for my results on the implications for historical American land policy. So that's about where we're going today. All right, so with that kind of introduction, let me talk a little bit about the historical background of the setting I'm going to be exploring. So in the mid to late 1800s, the United States was very, very eager to industrialize, but lacking the apparatus of the modern income tax, it didn't have a lot of money to fund large infrastructure projects, such as the construction of railroads across the continent. What it did have, however, was control over large amounts of Western land that was largely unsettled by American citizens. And the somewhat quirky idea that was implemented by the federal government was actually to pay many railroad companies to construct track using thousands and thousands of square miles of land. So you can see this was like a very important policy overall. And something like 10% of land within the continental United States actually was given over to some of these railroad companies in order to fund the construction projects. So, this was actually a major pillar of American land policy at the time. One other thing to note here, this is very, very different than sort of allocating a narrow strip of land that, the railroad can actually build tracks on. This is really about in-kind payments. So if you look at a state like Kansas or Nebraska, you'll see that something like 1/3 of it was actually given over to these railroad companies. And really, it's not like 1/3 of Kansas and Nebraska is covered by railroad tracks. In contrast, this is about large amounts of land being given over as a substitute for payment. So this is an important policy to study in its own right, but it also relates to these broader questions with which I began the talk. And that's for two reasons. So by the 1860s, the federal government, and in this case, the Union government, was very concerned about reducing levels of land concentration out on the frontier. And to do so, it passed the 1862 Homestead Act, which did two things. First, it put a cap on the amount of land that a settler could receive, typically, although not always, set at 160 acres. Secondly, the land would be available for free as long as a settler was willing to live on it. And as a consequence, this really promoted, sort of owner-style cultivation and low levels of land concentration. In contrast, and somewhat paradoxically, all of this land given over to the railroad companies was not regulated in any way. And these companies typically wanted to make a profit. And so what they did was they put their land up for sale on the open market, and whoever wanted to could buy however much of the land as they could afford. So if you were a wealthy person who wanted to obtain a large farm, really railroad lands were the only game in town. And as a consequence, these lands ended up becoming much more concentrated or, in the hands of these larger landlords relative to homestead areas. So, historical accounts sort of this period sort of bear this out. This is the historian Robert Gates writing about this period. And he says that the type of people who were attracted to these auctioned land, sort of had aspirations of becoming like the landed aristocracies in Europe. And in fact, there are very few legal or regulatory safeguards to prevent them from realizing these aspirations. So this is sort of the type of person we should have in mind as a potential purchaser. Now, a couple of institutional details are also relevant here. It turned out that the United States had control over so much fairly open land that it was able to impose a very regular system for surveying and demarcating these areas. And this is known as the Public Land Survey System. And basically it involved dividing up the American West into a large square grid. The main unit of this grid is known as a township, or a 6 by 6 mile square. And each township is further subdivided into 36 sections of 1 square mile each. And each section is given a number in a regular fashion, 1 through 36, as you can see here. So, a very regular survey system, in other words. And the regularity of the system allowed the government to put in place very strange policies about, and very formulaic policies about how land should be used. And the railroad land grants formula really was one of the quirkiest ones out there. And that's for two reasons. The first is that railroad companies could only receive the odd numbered sections or square miles of a particular township. That is, they could get sections 1, 3, and 5, but never 2, 4, or 6. Secondly, they would only receive land within a certain number of miles of the track they constructed. So, just to illustrate this with an example, the Union Pacific line out in western Nebraska received the odd numbered sections within 20 miles of its track. And this led to what many people termed a checkerboard pattern of railroad ownership. So you can see here that the Union Pacific received sort of every other square mile of land, and it received only land, within this fairly sharp boundary at a distance from the tracks that it constructed. So this is known as the railroad land grant checkerboard. And sort of the weirdness of the pattern is going to be very key to my statistical strategy, since sort of the arbitrariness of this formula will allow me to do better statistical estimation than I might otherwise be able to do. And I'll get into that a bit more later. All right. So as is the way with economic historians, this is going to be primarily a quantitative exercise. And so let me tell you a little bit about the data I collect here. The main data source I'm going to turn to, or the main sort of outcome that I'm going to turn to, is the value of land. And under any sort of standard pricing theory, the value of land, or any asset really, should reflect the future stream of benefits to all of its owners. So the land value is therefore going to be a very key measure of economic development. I'm going to collect very detailed data on this from about 380,000 square miles of land, so a big area in the American West. And it's going to be a very spatially and informationally rich data set that will allow me sort of, to look in a lot of detail about the impacts of this policy. I won't sort of go point by point for every other data set I collect, but broadly, I'm going to supplement this with some historical data sets that are a little bit smaller in geographic scale, so either confined to a single state or maybe a couple of individual counties. And these are going to give some extra information, for the historical period to kind of guide us in interpretation. Just to visualize what some of these look like, these are the property values in the vicinity of Helena, Montana. And you can see that they're very geographically detailed and, in my opinion at least, really very nice to look at. It's just a wonderful data set to use. In terms of the overall coverage, I've obtained, more or less the complete set of property tax information that I'd need for about 5 different states, as shown here. And then for Oregon, I was also able to obtain a couple of counties worth of information. So this is going to form the core of my sample here. All right, so, with that sort of introduction on the data out of the way, let me first just quickly prove to you that quantitatively that this railroad land grant policy and auctioning land off to the highest bidder actually did lead to increased levels of land concentration. So to look at that, I've put together a data set on historical land sales, both to sort of, from the railroad companies and from the federal government itself under the Homestead Act. And, I can look at these data sort of section by section or square mile by square mile and plot, at that level, the average amount of land a given owner owned in that area. Now, we can see that for the even numbered sections or the homesteaded ones, property sizes were maybe about 3 or 4 times as small as those in the odd numbered or the railroad pieces of land. So, to a first order, this railroad land grant policy really had a dramatic impact on land concentration. Now, one other cool thing you can do is I can sort of replicate this strategy, but instead of, looking at it inside the boundary, which is what you see on the left, I can look at the comparison outside the boundary between these even and odd numbered square miles. And, outside the boundary, these two pieces of land are administered under the same policy, the homestead policy. And there you see very little difference, and nothing statistically significant between the even and the odd numbers. So, and this sort of general type of comparison is going to form the core of my statistical strategy. But the main thing to note here is just that the railroad lands did indeed, create much more land inequality or land concentration. All right. So what were the economic impacts of this, these larger landowners and the land concentration that came with them? I'm going to show you that these larger owners were sort of bad at making investments and either, neglected or delayed these investments. And I'm going to show you that this reduced land values in the areas that they historically owned in ways that are still visible to the modern period. So this is pretty consistent with historical accounts that these, larger scale owners and their systems of tenant farming really didn't result in the best use of the land. And in particular, a lot of these larger owners failed to sort of improve their land or, to clear it for growing crops, instead preferring lower value activities such as cattle ranching. Now, since just a quick note on methods, since I think this is a fairly, diverse audience. But in general, for a quantitative explanation, you're typically presented with some sort of a, data set on a potential cause and a potential effect or an outcome. And, you want to have some sort of structure or formal way to discuss the relationship between these two things. And for the economist, this very standard tool in our toolkit is what's known as linear regression or ordinary least squares regression. And that's just a fancy technique of saying, we'll try and, fit sort of the best line between the potential cause and the potential outcome that we see here. And we'll be able to say things like whether or not this relationship is, statistically significant or whether it could have occurred by chance. Now, of course, there's nothing magic about this method. As we all know, correlation is not necessarily causation. And in general, if there's some other factor that's related to your potential cause, that can also explain this correlation that you find between your potential cause and your potential effect. So if there's some sort of hidden variable that's very correlated with your cause, maybe that's actually, the real causal channel, not the one that you've proposed. So the key thing that you want to do here is you want to find instances where your potential cause is either randomly distributed or, as good as randomly distributed. And in those cases, you can have a high level of confidence that the relationship you're plotting actually is causal. Since if something is randomly distributed, there can't be some sort of subsequent hidden factor that's related to it almost by definition. So and this is where, sort of the very weird allocation of property rights from the land grant formula comes into play. So all I'm really going to be doing is comparing these even numbered sections, which were, small scale owner cultivators, to the odd numbered sections with these larger landowners. And, it's going to result in this sort of side-by-side comparison of different blocks of square mile land. And, since this is such an arbitrary spatial pattern, we shouldn't imagine that, say, land quality or distance to a city or other sorts of features would differ across these two groups. Instead, really, the only thing that's going to differ is is who was initially given the property rights. Was it a small-scale owner or a larger, landlord? And that's going to give me a lot of confidence in interpreting, the comparisons I show you as causal estimates, not just, random correlations. So first, let me talk about historical levels of investment. And these are going to come from property tax assessments about the fraction of land that's marked as improved. So we should think of this as the owner has taken, some time and effort and resources to clear the land and start growing crops in order to receive a higher, yield per acre or a higher profit per acre. The alternative is to sort of just graze your cattle over, uncleared land or whatever natural vegetation there is, which doesn't require a lot of investment, but produces, typically less of a return per acre. Now, if we look at the relationship between land quality here on the x-axis and the fraction of land that's improved, we see almost none of these railroad owners are actually improving their pieces of land, regardless of the quality. In contrast, what you see is that these small-scale owners were improving some pieces of land, and moreover, they were doing so very selectively, very intelligently. And in particular, they were sort of improving the most productive half of these pieces of land, sort of the ones that would be best for growing crops. And what's also interesting is that if you fast forward about a century into the modern day and look at the modern relationship, you see, in fact, that more, the 100 years of market activity have more or less converged and confirmed to what these small scale holders were doing. And the relationship today is very similar to what the small scale holders were doing, with the railroad lands perhaps still lagging a little bit behind. So what this suggests is that these large scale owners actually, both prevented some level of investment on their lands, and for a larger set actually delayed the time when these investments would arrive. And when you sort of directly and quantitatively compare the property values of these two different groups, you see that historical land, large landowner ownership actually reduces property values by about 4.5% into the modern period. Now, if you haven't seen one of these regression tables before, this is just sort of a summary of running one of these analyses that I mentioned earlier. And the stars here denote a high level of statistical significance. The different sort of columns here denote different exact formulations. So in some of them, I try and adjust for things like the county these different sections or square miles are located in, or other sorts of characteristics about the land. But broadly, none of these make a difference, and even a very simple comparison gets essentially the same answer, which is what you'd expect, given that land quality shouldn't differ in these side-by-side square miles. So just to sort of underline this result, this is fairly remarkable, since this isn't a historical one, but a difference that's still visible about 150 years after land was initially allocated. And just sort of to confirm the validity of the strategy, I can replicate the same analysis, but I can do it in places where the railroad lands policy wasn't applied. So economists often call this a placebo check. We shouldn't expect to find anything here, since there was no difference between these even and odd numbered squares, except within the boundary. And indeed, we find only very small differences in property values across even and odd outside the grant boundary. And none of these are statistically distinguishable from zero. So we seem to really pass this placebo check, in other words. Okay, so these larger scale owners seem to be underinvesting in their properties. Why is this? Well, I'm gonna, as I said, point my finger at tenant farming in general and sharecropping in particular as the primary culprits. This again is what a lot of historical accounts suggest. Giving someone a large piece of land typically makes them into a landlord. And often these landlords have difficulty in motivating the tenant farmers who work for them. And that can lead to low levels of investment. So I can sort of directly measure this in the form of measuring absenteeism. That is, whether these large landlords actually live particularly close to their own properties, or whether they live in some sort of distant city. And indeed, you find that the owners of the railroad land are more likely to come from out of state or from another county, and less likely to live on farms themselves. That's true both historically and even into the modern period. You still see that on average, the owners of these pieces of land live about 3 or 4% further away from their properties, as recorded by their address and property tax assessments. We can also go a little bit further and ask, which sorts of arrangements between landlords and the tenants who work for them are driving this result. And it turns out that the counties with the biggest negative effects in my sample are ones where most of the tenants tend to be share tenants. And that is, they sort of split the output at the harvest. And in contrast, places where most of the tenants are renting actually see little or no negative impacts. So what this implies, in fact, is that the low-powered incentives of splitting the output actually are driving many of the results that I see. So this fits into a classical literature about either economists would say principal agent problems, or just sort of the difficulties in contracting. All right, the last major result I want to show you is just a little bit about markets. So, one of the theories I began with was that it shouldn't matter, who initially owns a piece of land. If a market is functioning well, the most efficient owner will actually end up in possession of it. And so it doesn't matter who should initially get the piece of land. The usage and the distribution of ownership should be the same once the market has time to adjust. And to kind of get a sense of that, I've plotted the amount of land concentration in both these odd numbered or landlord sections versus their even numbered counterparts. And you can see some evidence of this sort of dynamic. The gap between the large ownership and the small ownership is shrinking over time. But this is not a rapid process at all. And in fact, in the 70 years plotted here, it's not even a fully complete process. So markets are working to resolve these differences in the way you would expect, but they're taking much, much longer than you might initially have thought, given sort of that the frequency of sales here. So this is some evidence for markets functioning, but functioning imperfectly in this setting. All right, and the very last pitch for the broader paper I want to give to you is that I can use sort of the analysis I've done to make some claims about historical US land policy. And in particular, the optimal land policy would look very different from the one that was historically implemented. So, this is sort of a visualization of what was historically implemented. And in the light red, you see, these checkerboard areas that are, half small scale owner and half large scale owner. In contrast, just using the quantitative results that I find, I can try and find the optimal policy for ensuring high land values today. Even, forcing the federal government to pay railroad companies a certain amount, the same amount that they received historically, you would still tend to want to reward them with lower quality pieces of land that don't require high levels of investment. And in contrast, you would want to reserve sort of the better pieces of land for the small scale cultivators who are the most efficient at making the necessary investments. So the optimal policy would look very different than the historical one. And actually, in the paper, I showed that this would have increased modern land values by about 4 or 5 percentage points. As just another quick pitch for the paper, I look at a lot of other cool things, such as environmental impacts or political impacts. But just in the interest of time right now, I'm going to conclude. So I've explored essentially what we call a natural experiment in the American West that changed levels of land concentration about 150 years ago. The economic impact of increased levels of concentration was a less intensive and lower valued land use in those areas. And I argue that this was primarily the result of landlords' use of share tenant agreements. There's a lot of historical persistence in these effects. Markets are sort of resolving the differences between the two types of land, but they're only doing so very, very slowly. And what this implies is that, the initial allocation of land mattered a lot, and the efficient policy was at this time, was very different than the actual one. So, overall, I hope this paper can give us a bit of a different view of the American frontier. This is not an area that was dominated solely by, small scale owner cultivators, but one that had a fairly large presence of big landlords. And in fact, this latter group actually seemed to have inhibited economic development in these regions, both historically and in ways that are apparent up until the present day. So, that's what I have for you. Thank you for letting me go on for so long, and I'm really looking forward to your comments and questions on this work. And so, yeah, please raise your hand and we can have a discussion.
Thanks very much indeed, Cory, for an extremely interesting and engaging talk. I see Bill Fischel is the first with his hand up. Bill, welcome. You're first up, sir.
Okay. I actually thought I was going to be able to write this, but talking, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. This is a great paper. I'm really interested in this. I've just finished a manuscript about American counties, so I'm acquainted with the West and rural areas. Counties are all the rural stuff, and this is very interesting to me. One of the things that I've that I discovered, not in this research process, but in others, was that American town founders, people who laid out towns in the hope of very entrepreneurial activity, laid out towns in the hope of making lots of money, would lay out their towns in a kind of mini checkerboard fashion. That is, they would offer for sale a certain amount of land, and but in between they would hold on to the land, and they would do this. It was actually quite intentional, not accidental, intentional, because they thought there would be spillover benefits from the other guy doing the work, and other people coming in and taking up the unsold property held by the entrepreneur. This process actually goes even farther back, and I'll give you Hanover, New Hampshire as an example. Senator Wentworth granted towns in New Hampshire and part of New York. He was pretty far-reaching himself, and he would grant towns and essentially give the land away for free in a quote, to various people, religious churches in Connecticut and things like this. And they would send up settlers, but he would hold back 500 acres in the corner of his township in the hope that other people would do the work and he could then sell it later at a profit. So his strategy was to do it. In Hanover's case, he didn't make as much of a profit as he hoped, so he gave it to Eleazar Willock to found Dartmouth College. So that's what we're working on, is that hopeful. But this was a well-known process, and it was replicated by a number of other people out west. And so I'm thinking that Congress, in setting up this land, actually might have known this. And so this might not have been a random thing. And in some ways, this actually makes Cory's your outcome more interesting, insofar as it didn't work because of the monopolization, because of the concentration, which other people, of course, other voices said was bad from the get-go. That's why they wanted the thing to like the homestead and so forth. But that's I'm not sure that's a reference you make in your longer papers, but that's what I thought of.
Yeah, and I actually didn't realize that about many Western towns. That's really fascinating, and I think it'd actually be very interesting to sort of replicate this style of analysis, but zoom in on the towns. I think that would be very cool.
Other questions for Cory Smith? Urzo?
I think we got one.
Urzo Lutmer, you're next.
Yeah, here. So Cory, I was wondering whether actually the land sold to the railroad really got a fair shot, because in the end they were still relatively small plots that were separated from other plots, like what was it, 640 acres maximum. And so is it you tell me, is it possible that they couldn't really get the economies of scale that might have helped them if they had gotten, plots of thousands of acres?
Yeah, so a lot of people have wondered, about sort of what they call land fragmentation here. And, if you wanted a plot larger than the 640 acres, which is 1 square mile, you would potentially need to have a diagonal connection only, at least in the initial period. So this is something I go into a bit more detail on in the paper. My sense is that this wasn't a big impact for 2 reasons. So first, at the time, if we go back all the way to 1900, a 640 acre or 1 square mile farm is actually still pretty large. So something like in the top 5% of effective farm units, according to the census there. So, you're already talking about things that are pretty large. Additionally, there may be some sort of, frustration in having, a very narrow diagonal connection, but to a first order, you can still just by buying small pieces of land or, having right of way, easily connect those areas, even if the shapes look a little bit wonky. And the third reason also is that if you try and do a formal measure of land fragmentation, it disappears fairly rapidly within about a generation, relative to the even numbered areas. So, my sense is that's not a big detriment here.
Thanks very much. I've got a kind of a very, very general question, Cory.
Sure.
I don't know whether this is going to fit in your wheelhouse or not. Some historians, I'm thinking of Neil Ferguson, for example, make very, very large claims about comparative development of North America versus Latin America, let's say, by comparing the hacienda system that developed in Latin America, which really did play to a desire for social status, a desire to replicate aristocracy, nobility of a traditional sort of European type, and successfully in many places in Latin America, not all, but some, as opposed to the more homesteady type of a model that Ferguson and others associate with North America, British North America in particular. And the typical example of that, of course, is, as you alluded in your paper, the Homestead Act of 1862 with its allotment of 160 acres per settler. So I guess my really big picture question is whether you would consider that your research materially revises or alters that kind of general picture that Ferguson and others make, or does it fit fairly comfortably within it, or does it maybe just not really intersect with that literature at all?
Yeah, thank you for that. So, first I should just say that it's always difficult to, extrapolate from, one setting into another, and we have to be very, very careful about that. And, in particular, I think I'll just list what I think is the most salient difference. We talked about these larger landowners in the United States, and these are certainly people who aspired to that, at least according to some accounts, aspired to that sort of, landed aristocrat status. However, you don't exactly have the same sort of feudal tradition in the United States with these larger owners as you did, say, in Europe or maybe parts of Latin America. And, that's potentially one thing that could make comparisons difficult. So, I think it sort of has to be up to the consumer of this research how much you want to extrapolate from this to other settings. For my taste, I think I'm happy to, chalk one up to the agricultural efficiency of small-scale ownership, but the political elements are best explored in another setting. Though again, your taste may vary about how much to extrapolate from this example. In terms of the whether or not we should think of the United States as a fairly equal in terms of its land distribution, again, I think there's not a binary yes or no. So actually, if we go back very, very early to like this slide, I mean, the United States did have, as these things go, a somewhat more equal distribution of land relative to some other countries. So it's a bit more equal than the UK, for example, at around the same time. And the frontier seems to have been, at least, the sample I've been able to construct, even more equal. So, there was a big benefit to the Homestead Act in ensuring a more even distribution of land. And obviously this paper argues for the economic benefits of that. Still, though, it's not a binary. It's not that there was a fully equal distribution of land received. And, even with the Homestead Act and the impulses for that, there were still contrasting impulses that benefited very wealthy or politically connected people who ended up being the ones to buy the land from these railroad companies. So, this is all to say, perhaps the United States did better than some other cases, but certainly it wasn't perfect. And in fact, there was a lot of political controversy around railroad land grants, and many people argued it was sort of a corrupt giveaway to connected people. So this was something people were very aware of at the time.
I think we have time for one more question. Urzo, is your hand still up? Did you want to speak again?
Sorry, I forgot to put it down.
That's quite all right. We've come to the end of our time. Cory, thank you very, very much for a most interesting talk. Thanks to the rest of you for coming today. I wish all of you safety, sanity, and good health. And we'll look forward to seeing you again in the spring term of 2021. Bye-bye now.
All right. Thanks, everyone, so much. Really, really great being here. And thank you, Hank.